исламское государство нацеливается на господство в исламском мире. И не только там. Только этими планами явно не ограничиваются.
So long as they continue to pursue a mistaken strategy and hit these targets. What we will do is continue basic technical discussions on professional safety procedures for our pilots flying about Syria. That's it.
We offered our partners to exchange data on where ISIL targets are located, but we received no response. This means that either our partners don't have the data or they don't want us to hit ISIL targets for some reason.
Washington claims Russia is becoming increasingly isolated over its bombing of ISIL. I spoke with Sergei Trifkovich, foreign affairs editor of Chronicles magazine. He thinks the US is trying to save face by ignoring the success of the anti-terror coalition led by Russia.
For only 10 days of air attacks, the Russians, combined with the Syrian boots on the ground, have done more to degrade ISIS than the Americans in over a year of their half-hearted campaign.
The White House says there are risks involved for Russia over its intervention in Syria. Let's take a listen together to what was said.
The fact is, we see Russia doubling down on their support for Bashar al-Assad. That only draws them further and further into a civil war inside of Syria. And it risks a variety of things. It risks Russia's further isolation from the international community.
Jet that went down on the Turkish-Syrian border was a Russian Su-24 Frontline bomber. It insists the jet did not violate Turkish airspace, but was down from the ground, and that mission data can prove that. We know that the jet was flying at an altitude of 6,000 meters, according to the Russian military. This video shows a jet crashing. The Turkish military says it was shot down by its own warplanes after it ignored warnings. It went down in the Kızıldag mountains, which are currently, as we've been speaking about earlier, a point of conflict between Syrian government troops and militants. Debris from the plane, this is another aspect, hit 2 people on the ground in a Syrian village. Just to reiterate what's being said during the flight, this is a quote: the aircraft was flying within the borders of Syria, which was registered by objective monitoring data. That's from the Russian Defense Ministry. And again, it was supposedly shot down from the ground. The Russian Defense Ministry is stating. The Turkish Prime Minister has ordered the country's top diplomat to consult with NATO, the United Nations, and all parties concerned with the situation on the Syrian border. Well, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense as well, the fate of the pilots is now being clarified, but both reportedly ejected from the plane and parachuted to safety. You can just about make out a parachute here in media accounts on Twitter from Turkish media. Russian military helicopters are now searching for them. And you can see, as I say, Turkish media showing what they say is the pilot's descent from that downed Russian fighter jet. Well, Ilya Petrenko is still here with me in the studio, just really digesting all this information that's coming into us. We're hearing varying accounts, aren't we, from the Russian Ministry of Defense and also from Ankara. We're trying to figure out just what occurred and where it occurred in this incident. Turkey says that the plane went across their border. It was shot down in Syria. Just bring us up to date with Turkey's role here in the region, because we know it's a complicated one for starters.
Well, I can also tell you that Ankara is saying that the plane was warned 10 times before it was shot down. That's one of the latest updates from the headquarters of the Turkish army. Speaking of Turkey's role in the region, of course, it's an enormously important regional player. and they've been keen on expanding that influence. Also, of course, Turkey is a NATO member. Now, speaking of the tensions in the region and Turkish regional interests, Ankara has been known for its anti-Assad rhetoric and also repeated calls to overthrow the current Syrian government. Of course, they are known for the tension with Kurds, both on Turkish land and also inside Syria, as we know that the Kurds are fighting for more autonomy or even independence from Turkey, tensions with Iran, and also links, in some cases, close ties with some factions of the Syrian rebels that are fighting Syrian government troops on Syrian territory. So it's really complicated. Turkey, with a lot of its interests, a lot of the aspects that can really affect the difficult political situation on the ground there.
And just to add something more into the mix, according to CNN Turk, they said a little bit earlier that one of the pilots was in the hands of Turkmen forces. Of course, the Turkmens, who have closely related links to Ankara as well, ethnic Turks really living in Syria. So that's adding something else into the mix there. We have to wait for confirmation on that. But just to add to what you're saying about Turkey, it's come into the spotlight, as you mentioned just earlier at the start of your answer, for its controversial policy in the region. Just talk us through, give us a sense, almost a timeline of what Turkey has been saying to do with this conflict.
We have received hints from some international players of Turkey's involvement in illegal trade illegal oil trade with Islamic State. But last year we even heard from the U.S. Treasury, which openly listed Ankara on this list of international parties that are involved in this illegal oil trade. And I can tell you that the Russian president, during the G20 summit, recent G20 summit, which took place just hundreds of kilometers away in Antalya in Turkey, talked a lot about the issue of financing Islamic State. Of course, most of that money comes from that illegal oil trade. And he said that he's got evidence that it's coming from 40 countries around the world, and some of these countries are in the G20. He didn't say Turkey directly.
Did not specify, yeah.
But perhaps he was driving at some links there.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan strongly opposing Russia's joining in the bombing campaign in Syria, calling it a, quote, grave mistake. Let's take a listen.
The steps Russia is taking and the bombing campaign in Syria are quite unacceptable to Turkey. Unfortunately, Russia is making a grave mistake. Its actions in Syria are worrying and disturbing. The countries that cooperate with the Syrian regime will be accountable to history.
What's your thoughts on the president's statement?
Well, I would say that the common enemy is the IS. And so long as Russia and Iran and others are focusing on the IS, and even the West is doing the same. So why can't they cooperate rather than say that it should not happen? So I have a feeling that they are probably worried about the regime. They don't want the regime to be sustained. But at this point of time, if you unravel the regime, then the conditions would be very similar to what happened to Iraq. Because if there is no regime, then there is so much of chaos that it's only organizations like IS that flourish.
Used the country's air force in Syria, with Islamic State named by Moscow as a threat to its national interests. And the Russian move has been welcomed by the Syrian government. Moscow was earlier asked by Damascus for more help in the fight against terrorists. Western governments have started changing their minds over the role and the future of President Assad and his government in Syria. So we could be looking at a big change in a, well, ultimately Western strategy on Syria.
Assad needs to go.
Assad has to go.
Assad cannot be a credible partner for us.
It is time for him to go.
He definitely has to be part of the negotiations.
Political resolution can only come about through negotiation.
We have to acknowledge this is a total failure.
Let's not kid ourselves, that's a joke.
Our coalition is on the offensive. ISIL is on the defensive, and ISIL is going to lose.
Russian and American air forces have coordinated their flights in the region in order to avoid situations like this one, which of course makes sense. But why is there no coordination of flights between Russia and Turkey?
Once again, that's a very good question. Well, Turkey really doesn't want that, because Turkey is interested, for one, when they did militarily intervene in Syria, it's been against the Kurds. The Kurds are the main problem for Turkey, and yet the Kurds are one of the key elements in the fight against ISIL. On the ground, you have Syrian forces, government forces, and you have the Kurdish forces, which are really, hard to replace. You don't have a replacement for them right now, and yet Turkey has been concentrating a majority of its own military moves in Syria against the Kurds, not against ISIL. So, once again, we see the paradoxical situation in which Turkey is, and, Turkey, of course, claims that it's fighting against terrorists, but we know its main stated purpose is to remove the Assad government and to prevent the Kurds from forming an autonomy in Syria along the border with Turkey, because once again, they're afraid of the effect that would have on their own Kurdish population inside Turkey. So Turkey has to walk a tightrope once again, but it's not playing with open cards, and that's a big problem, not just for everyone else, but for Turkey itself.
Alexander Pavic, political analyst, thank you very much for coming on RT International and sharing your thoughts with us this hour.
Не амбициями, создать по-настоящему широкую международную антитеррористическую коалицию, как и антигитлеровская коалиция.
Well, Russia had previously unveiled plans to unite forces fighting Islamic State from the air and on the ground. It also insisted on including the Syrian government troops in the battle against the terrorists as one of the most potent anti-ISIL forces. Now, Russia's plan was raised during the meeting of Russia's president and his American counterpart. No specific arrangements were revealed, but both countries acknowledged they do have common grounds in the fight against Islamic State. Now, in an interview with RT Arabic, the Iraqi foreign minister said that new countries joining the fight against ISIS is a very positive move.
The more countries take part in the fight against terrorism, the better, especially if it's countries that have been affected by terrorism themselves. Terrorism is like fire. It spreads across borders. It's already spread from Syria to Iraq and can spread further. That's why it's important to consolidate the international effort against terrorism. We feel that we can't cooperate with states that support terrorism or prepares and finances fighters.